story one in those years when I was in elementary school. The world seemed much simpler. My friends and I were inseparable, and we were all interested in one strange thing, collecting books about ghosts and supernatural phenomena. These books seemed something special to us, even magical. They were full of scary stories about ghosts, evil spirits, and all sorts of supernatural events that would scare anyone. But we were children, and fear only increased our curiosity. We exchanged books, stole volumes from each other that were becoming rare. Danae, our classmate, was especially passionate about this topic. She always kept her books like treasures, and her eyes lit up when she began to read aloud. Every time during recess, we would sit in a circle and whisper under our desks, telling each other scary stories. In those days, each new ghost book seemed like an event. We would wait until someone finished reading their book to swap volumes. We would sit at our desks, staring at the pages, barely paying attention to the teachers, ready to share the new horror we had found within the pages. "Read faster so we can all exchange," Dana said with such excitement that it would have made anyone wince. She sat across from me, with the book in her hands, her fingers running through the pages, trying to finish it faster so we could hear the story of some ghost or strange thing that happened to someone in our country. One evening, when I was already at home, book in hand, I came across a book that was different from the others. The pages seemed the same as all the others, but the content was different. I couldn't even remember the exact title of the story, but I remember being struck by one detail that made me feel a strange tension inside. It was a curse that was supposed to overtake you at 3 in the morning if you somehow got to read this book. I froze, running my eyes over the lines, and my heart began to beat faster. I always thought that such things were fiction, but the more I read, the more it seemed to me that this story was real. My mother, as always, did not share my fascination with these scary stories. She would always say, "You're just scaring yourself with this," and I would nod in understanding, but deep down I knew that these were not just empty words. Something about these stories really bothered me, but I couldn't stop. I was curious to know what would happen if this curse really came true. It was like a call, something alluring and scary that made me return to the story again and again. That night, when I went to bed, I had trouble falling asleep. Thoughts about this book were spinning in my head, and a strange feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. My gaze slid around the dark corners of the room, and even the ordinary sound of the wind outside the window began to seem unusual. I turned on my side, trying to find a comfortable position, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My eyes darted around the room, and every creak of the old door or the crack of wood in the corner made me flinch. I heard my brother's footsteps in the next room fade away, and the room became even quieter. I pressed myself against the pillow and tried to close my eyes, but they wouldn't obey. My heart was pounding, and I felt cold sweat covering my skin. The same thing kept spinning in my head. 3 o'clock in the morning. At that moment, I felt like I wouldn't be able to fall asleep until I looked at the clock. I stood up and walked to the window to look at the clock on the wall. At that very moment, I heard a sound. It was a light, almost imperceptible rustling that came from a dark corner. I froze, turning around. Nothing was visible, only the darkness, as always, was creeping into the room. The wind rustled in the leaves outside the window, and everything seemed so real. Fear, like a thick, foggy veil, enveloped me. I looked at the clock again. 3 a.m., the very moment that was mentioned in the book, but nothing happened. I even thought it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. I heard footsteps, but they weren't mine. I heard someone slowly walking across the room, and I froze. At that moment, it seemed to me that the air became thick, and I could hardly breathe. I closed my eyes, praying for this feeling to go away, but it only grew stronger. I rolled over and pulled the blanket closer to me, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead of calming down, I began to think more and more about the book and what was happening in the story. This moment, these events, a sense of a presence that wasn't there. I tried to calm myself, but I couldn't. When I finally managed to close my eyes, I felt someone standing next to me. Someone invisible. But I felt them as if they were there, right next to me. At that moment, fear took over me completely. I tried to breathe, but the air was so heavy that my lungs could not fill with it. I knew what I had to do to make it all stop, but I could not find the strength. The night passed and I woke up, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. It was something more than just fear. It was something that made me constantly look around and anxiously look into dark corners. But I kept silent. I did not tell anyone what had happened. I did not want to be considered a coward. And so it went on every night. My obsession with ghost books only grew stronger. But this time I knew that when you play with something you can't understand, it can come back and find you. A few days had passed since I read that strange story about the curse, and life had somehow returned to its usual course. But that moment when I felt her, an invisible, eerie presence, still haunted me. I tried not to think about it, but the more I tried to forget, the stronger the fear that tormented me became. The nights became more and more restless. My gaze darted more and more often to the corners of the room, and every sound seemed alien and threatening to me. I was lying in my bed again, trying to sleep, but the air was strange. Every night when I closed my eyes, I felt like the space around me was getting thicker, like someone or something was filling the silence. penetrating it. I knew it was the same feeling I had felt that night when I read about the curse. I thought it was just my imagination, that it couldn't be real. But every night it seemed like this fear wasn't my imagination. It was real. Every day I became more and more afraid to go to bed. I began to notice how my nights were filled with fear. I could no longer rest normally, because even during the day I could not get rid of the thought that I was not alone. I began to watch every step, every rustle. I could not explain what it was, but every night I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, as if on schedule. I had trouble concentrating on my studies. My attention kept slipping, and I felt like this shadow, this fear that I couldn't get out of my head, was starting to affect my thoughts. I felt myself becoming increasingly restless, as if something that had no form was watching me. Throughout the day, I tried to pretend that everything was okay, but inside, the anxiety kept growing. One day, after school, I returned home and found that my mother, as usual, had not noticed my condition. She was busy with household chores, and I did not want to disturb her. I tried to return to my usual activities, reading books and playing with toys, but one thought kept sounding in my head: what will happen tonight? I decided that I needed to spend more time with friends to distract myself from this worry. We continued to exchange books and discuss new stories, but with each passing day I was tormented by this indescribable fear. Then one day, my mother said that we needed to rearrange the place. I didn't know why, but she decided to move our beds to another place. Of course, I couldn't understand why, but I didn't object. This time, she chose an old storage room on the second floor. It was strange because the storage room had always been a place we didn't go, as it was full of old things and dust. But what was even stranger was that this storage room opened onto a balcony that overlooked the neighboring cemetery. I stood in the doorway, dumbfounded and shocked. This was the place I had read about so often in books, a place that was always associated with something sinister and creepy. It was not a place to sleep, and there was no point in putting our beds there. I just couldn't believe that my mother had made this choice. I didn't tell her that it scared me. I couldn't. I didn't want to look weak in front of her. I didn't want her to think that I was afraid. I told her that I wasn't afraid. I was old enough not to be afraid of such stupid things. I thought that if I was confident and calm, everything would be okay. But even with all that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fear was coming back. It was squeezing me as I lay down to sleep, and it was bothering me again when I closed my eyes. When night fell, I lay down in bed, hoping that everything would be normal. But in fact, everything was different. The room we now called the bedroom was strangely warm. I felt the air growing heavy, and with every breath I took, it seemed to press down on me. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was that? What was this pressure? This wasn't a normal hot summer. It was something else, something invisible that filled the space around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't relax. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but the fear wouldn't leave me. I could hear the leaves rustling outside the window, but there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl. I could have sworn I felt a presence. I felt someone watching me again, an invisible figure that seemed to be watching my every move. All I did was try to sleep, but at that moment I realized, no matter how much time has passed, this fear, this feeling that someone is next to you, will always be with you, and no matter what you try to do, you can't get rid of it. The next day, when I woke up, I had the same question in my head that I couldn't forget: what will happen tomorrow night? I didn't tell anyone about it because I didn't want to look weak, but the nights became more intense, and the fear became more real. Several weeks had passed since I had encountered those strange experiences, and I could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety that accompanied me everywhere. Every night became a test for me, and each time I felt the fear gripping me more and more. At such moments, it seemed to me that I could not breathe, that something invisible was filling the space around me. I tried to be strong, tried to tell myself that it was all just my fantasy, that there could be nothing supernatural. But despite my efforts, fear continued to torment me. I began to notice that my nighttime experiences were becoming more intense. Every now and then, I thought I heard quiet footsteps or soft rustling sounds in the dark corners of my room. These sounds seemed to have no source, and the more I tried to figure out what was going on, the more I became convinced that something was wrong. My room had become a trap for me, a place where the shadows of the night came to life and haunted me. I thought about the storage room on the second floor, where my bed now stood. I thought maybe it had been a mistake to move it there. After all, the place wasn't just old and forgotten. It felt dark, like there was something sinister in the air that seeped into the walls. Every night when I went to bed, I felt like those walls were closing in on me. I couldn't explain the feeling, but it was real. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it grew stronger with each passing day. One night, when I couldn't sleep again, I decided to explore the house. I knew it was illogical, but I couldn't stop. My gaze slid into dark corners, and every creak of the floor under my feet made me flinch. I went to the windows, where the dark silhouettes of trees seemed as ominous as the night sky. The wind that blew outside made a strange noise, as if something unnatural was moving in the darkness. I tried to calm down and went back to my bed, but as soon as I settled in, the feeling of a presence returned. It was as if someone was standing right next to me, invisible, but very real. I tried to close my eyes, but I couldn't forget the strange sounds I was hearing, and how they were becoming louder and more distinct. I felt a chill run down my spine, and something in the room became even darker. I didn't know how to explain it, but something was wrong. I stood up and looked at my watch. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. At that very moment, I felt the silence around me break. Suddenly, the air in the room became thick, as if something incredibly heavy was hanging in space. I stood in complete silence, not daring to move. I heard the sound again, light footsteps moving across the room. I froze, not believing my ears, but the sound was becoming clearer. Someone was walking around me, but I couldn't see anyone. I quickly looked around, but there was no one in the room. Fear gripped me. I felt my breathing get heavy, and suddenly something made me turn to the corner of the room. There, in the darkest place, stood a figure. I couldn't make out its features. It was like a shadow, but its presence was obvious. It didn't move, but I knew it was there. I couldn't say a word. I just stood there, afraid to even breathe. The figure was getting closer with each passing moment, and I didn't know what to do. All I could do was turn to the wall and try to pretend that it wasn't there, that it didn't exist. But the feeling that something was watching me didn't leave me. At some point, I felt the figure come very close, and although I couldn't see it, I was sure that it was there. My thoughts were confused and incoherent. I didn't know what to do, and only thought about how to somehow regain the feeling of safety. The night dragged on like an eternity. I didn't know how much time had passed, but suddenly I realized that the figure had disappeared. Everything returned to its previous state, and silence filled the room again. I tried to fall asleep again, but the fear wouldn't leave me. I felt it penetrating my thoughts, its cold gaze pursuing me. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew that these strange phenomena were not stopping, but only getting stronger. With each passing day, with each nightmare, I became more and more convinced that this house was not just an ordinary place. It hid something that defied explanation. I thought that perhaps all these supernatural occurrences were simply the result of my fear and imagination, but I could not shake the feeling that something was really wrong, and every time I tried to ignore it, it returned in even more terrifying forms. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but what could I do? How could I get rid of this shadow that followed me, this ominous presence that filled every night? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing: whatever it was, I couldn't escape it. And every day I felt it getting closer. A few days passed, and it seemed like the nights were getting longer and darker. I didn't know when I started to perceive every rustle, every sound as a potential threat, but it was becoming a part of my life. The fear didn't leave me, and with each passing day it became more and more real. Even the light of daytime didn't help to get rid of this feeling that settled in my soul like an invisible shadow following me. I kept trying to keep up a normal appearance. I went to school, I met with friends, but every time I was alone, I felt that shadow returning. And despite all my efforts, it became more and more intrusive. The day I first noticed my hands twitching from tension, I realized that I could no longer ignore what was happening. I couldn't continue to live with this fear, and perhaps I was even starting to get used to it. I remembered how at night, in that very room, I would wake up and hear footsteps. I didn't know then what it really was. I thought it was just the wind or a random noise. But now, as I lay in my bed, I wasn't so sure. Everything was different. The footsteps were clearer, and the space was more full. I felt that this shadow, which I couldn't see but felt, was approaching. Every day I became more and more aware that something strange was happening in the room. I tried to explain it to myself, but each time I could not find a logical explanation. I was sure that no one in the house walked at night. I could not believe it, but everything became so obvious that I simply could not ignore these sensations. I began to feel how everything around me was shrinking, how the air became dense and heavy. It was a feeling that I was not alone, that someone was with me in this space, someone who should not have been here. When the night came, I decided not to go to bed. I didn't want to feel that shadow watching me anymore. I decided to take matters into my own hands and figure out what was going on. I got up and turned on the light, hoping it would make me feel safer. But it didn't work. The light didn't help. I felt it start to fade, like the darkness was consuming it. The room was strangely quiet, but I heard it again. Footsteps. Very distinct footsteps that echoed around the room. I turned around, hoping it was just my imagination, but it was all too real. I was standing in the center of the room, and suddenly I realized that something was standing right in front of me. It was so eerie that I couldn't move. I was staring at an empty space, but I knew it was there. It wasn't just my imagination. I felt the air tighten around me like something invisible, but very real, was standing in front of me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey me. I stood there paralyzed. I didn't know how to fight it, how to get rid of this fear that was now filling me. I felt this presence getting closer with each passing second. I saw it, felt it, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't something I could just let go of. I decided to go back to bed. I thought that if I closed my eyes, everything would disappear, but it was a mistake. As soon as I lay down, I felt him again. He was there, next to me. I couldn't move. I tried to close my eyes, but the fear wouldn't let me go. My whole body was tense, as if I was ready for something terrible. At that moment, I realized that the nights would no longer be the same. Something had changed, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Fear took over me. I felt like this shadow was watching my every move now. I tried to believe that it was just my imagination, that it wasn't that important. But every night when I closed my eyes, I felt its presence. It was real, and I couldn't find a way to get rid of it. Fear became my constant companion. It followed me wherever I went. I tried to find an explanation, tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. But with each passing day, it became more and more real, and now I understood that in this house, not everything was as it should be. This shadow, this presence that I felt, it was real, and I did not know how to cope with it. The night came too quickly, as if time were moving at a strange accelerated speed, and I found myself again in this house, which now seemed alien and ominous to me. It seemed that with each passing day it became darker and darker, and I increasingly felt its walls closing in on me. This feeling did not leave me even in those moments when I tried to forget and immerse myself in ordinary affairs. Even the bright day could not dispel this darkness that settled in every corner of the house, in every rustle. I tried not to think about it, tried to live my normal life, but every night, when I returned home, I felt like something was wrong. The space around me began to become cramped, and the air became heavy. I couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing bothered me. Every night the room became colder. In the place where I slept, the air was always a little thicker, as if someone was standing nearby, invisible but tangible. When I woke up at night, I felt it. This shadow, without form, it was there. I couldn't stay in the room for long. Every sound, every rustle, even the slight breeze coming through the window felt like a threat. I decided to spend the night in another part of the house. I knew it wasn't a solution, but I didn't know what else to do. I opened the door to the other room, but as soon as I stepped into its dark corner, I felt something change. Everything was quieter, darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I lay on my new bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting for the shadow to appear again. And there it was, that feeling. I couldn't explain it in words, but it was real. I felt a chill creep into my bones, as if someone was coming toward me. And even though I couldn't see anything, I knew she was there. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a knowing. Suddenly I heard it, footsteps. They were quiet, almost imperceptible, but I knew they weren't just my imagination. I felt each step bringing me closer to fear. But the moment I realized it wasn't just my imagined threat, I was overcome with horror. It was something unnatural, something that shouldn't be here. I knew that nothing good would happen to me if I stayed. And yet I couldn't bring myself to get up and leave. My hand shook as I tried to pull the blanket, but I couldn't. I froze as I felt the presence again. It was standing next to me. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I was completely paralyzed. At that moment, I realized that I might not be able to get out of here. This house wasn't just a place to live, it was something more. It was watching me, and I was its prisoner. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but the night seemed to stretch on forever. Everything around me was engulfed in darkness. I was trapped, and I didn't know what to do. Even if I got up and left the room, the feeling of this presence continued to haunt me. It wasn't just a figure. It was something I couldn't understand. I didn't know where it came from or how to deal with it. The silence in the room became heavy, and everything around me seemed filled with this strange feeling that I couldn't describe. I felt myself breathing heavily, my mouth dry. I couldn't relax, because I knew that as soon as I relaxed my attention, something would happen again. And no matter how hard I tried to resist the fear, it was always there. The night turned into morning, but I could not fall asleep. I spent the whole night without moving, afraid to even turn my head. When dawn came, I felt relief, but I knew it was not the end. I knew that the shadow would come again, and I would have to face it. And so, when morning came, I realized that I could no longer live in this house. I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. It was more than just my fears. I knew there was something hidden here, something that couldn't be explained. I was ready to leave this place, but I was still left wondering what it was and how I could get rid of this presence. Every night I woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone was standing next to me. That heavy, ominous air that was always in the room did not leave me. I woke up at 3 a.m., and despite the fact that I had long understood that this was not just an accident, I continued to wait, hoping that one day it would end. I prayed to God that this was just a bad dream that would pass one day, but the fear did not leave me, and with each passing day it became more and more real. I was returning to the old room again. Mom and Dad didn't understand what was wrong with me, but in their eyes I was still an ordinary child, who was simply experiencing childhood fears. I couldn't explain to them what was happening. Even if I tried, they wouldn't believe me. So I remained in my silence because I knew that no one would understand me. When I started sleeping in that room again, it wasn't the same place I'd known before. Suddenly, I began to notice things I hadn't noticed before. Subtle shadows moving outside the windows, strange sounds in the darkness. The noisy wind that blew leaves off the trees outside the window suddenly became too loud. It seemed to carry some hidden message with it that I couldn't decipher. I tried to keep my eyes open, but when the shadow appeared, I couldn't help myself. My body was freezing and my mind was increasingly filled with fear. The whole room became like foreign territory, and I was its prisoner. I didn't want to see that face anymore, the one I couldn't describe, but knew was there. I knew that this invisible threat was just waiting for me to let my attention slacken, and as soon as I relaxed, it came. I began to lose sleep because every time I woke up at night, I could feel her near me. The wind that blew into the room felt like it was part of her. I could hear her breathing. It was soft, like the rustling of leaves, but it was not of this world. I could feel it, and it was getting closer. I didn't know how to behave anymore. Fear was taking over me and I couldn't find a way out. At some point, I decided not to sleep again, to maybe prove to myself for once that I wasn't crazy. I decided to just sit in the room and wait for what would happen. But the longer I stayed in the dark, the stronger the fear became. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't control my body. I couldn't stop feeling this presence. Then I decided to try something else. I tried praying. I wasn't religious, but at that moment it seemed like only prayer could help. I prayed, whispering the words, trying to free myself from this feeling that had taken hold of me. I knew that if I didn't do something, I would lose control. It got worse every day. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. It was real, and I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. It was more. I couldn't understand how or why it happened, but I felt like this shadow was waiting for me. I woke up every night at 3 a.m. My hands were cold, and my chest was squeezed by an unimaginable heaviness. I knew she would be there, and I felt her presence again. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was like a stagnation in the air, when every movement, every breath was a desperate attempt to break free. I felt like I couldn't go on any longer. I was on the edge. I didn't know how to deal with this fear, how to get rid of this presence. I wasn't sure that it could be explained anymore. I felt like this shadow was now an integral part of me. It was becoming more and more solid, more and more real. There was no point in praying again. I tried to leave the house, but wherever I went, I felt her trace. It was like some unknown force that was watching me all the time. I was no longer sure that this house was a safe place. It seemed to me that I was doomed. I was losing hope, and this feeling became my reality. And yet, I knew I had to find a way to stop it. I couldn't just give up anymore. I was going to face this thing, figure out what it wanted from me, and defeat it. But just when I thought I'd be ready for any challenge, I realized it would take more than just courage. I didn't have the confidence to just open my eyes and face what stood in the dark. Every night I continued to wake up at 3 a.m. It was inevitable. I could no longer figure out how to fall asleep, knowing that every time I closed my eyes, I was confronted with what was hidden in the darkness. I became afraid of my own sleep, my own body, because every time I fell asleep I felt like I was losing control of myself. Hour after hour, day after day, I remained in this constant struggle with the unknown. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt fear creeping into every corner of my mind. It was becoming an integral part of me, like a constant companion that never left me for a second. I tried to distract myself from these thoughts by immersing myself in books, movies, talking to friends. But despite all my efforts, the shadow was always there. It lived in this house, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I remembered how I loved reading ghost books as a child. They seemed like just scary stories to share with friends. But ever since this shadow had come into my life, I had realized that there was a greater reality hidden in these stories than I could have imagined. And that reality was right in front of me, in the darkness of my room, in sounds I couldn't explain. My nights became sleepless, my days empty and filled with anxiety. I felt myself slipping away more and more. When I woke up, I felt her presence, like someone was standing next to me, looking at me. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. All I could do was try to calm down, wait for this feeling to go away, for it to be over. But it didn't go away. I couldn't cope with it alone. I started looking for help. I talked to my mother and told her about my experiences, but she didn't believe me. She thought it was just nightmares. My father was even more skeptical. They said I was just reading too much and imagining scary stories. I felt completely alone. There was no one who could understand what was happening. I decided to take a drastic step. I turned to an old family friend who was familiar with the traditions of Filipino shamanism. He was old, but he knew how to work with spirits and entities. I told him about all my nightly experiences, about the shadow that would not leave me alone. He listened to me carefully and said that I was not alone. He told me that this entity could be connected to the spirit that had become attached to me because I had once read that scary story. She's not just watching you, he said. She wants you to know she's there, and she'll keep coming until you're no longer afraid of her. I didn't understand what he meant. How can I stop being afraid of something I can't control? How can I fight something that is invisible and intangible? He said I needed to face this thing, not run, but embrace its presence. I needed to realize that this shadow had no power over me unless I allowed it to. It sounded like I needed to break my own fear, but I wasn't ready. I could still feel it watching me, getting closer and closer. But suddenly, one night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard her footsteps. They were quiet, but clearly audible. They were not human footsteps, but something else, light, barely noticeable, but they were scary. I curled up in my bed and tried not to move, hoping that it would pass like everything else. But the footsteps did not stop. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound, as if someone was breathing heavily nearby. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were constricted, and I didn't know what to do. But in that moment, something inside me changed. I realized that this creature couldn't hurt me unless I allowed myself to. I couldn't be a prisoner of my fear any longer. I slowly opened my eyes. Everything was quiet. I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. I couldn't feel her presence next to me. In that moment, I realized that maybe I had finally learned to cope with this. I couldn't say that she was gone, but I knew that I was no longer her prisoner. From that moment on, the nights became less scary. The fear didn't go away, but I learned to live with it. I no longer woke up in a cold sweat. I learned to look into the darkness and not be afraid of what was hidden in it. And although the shadow still visited me sometimes, I knew that I could control my fear. The process of recovery was long. I was still in the lab, surrounded by technology that had once promised me salvation and knowledge that had proven useless. I looked at the equipment, and it no longer had the meaning I had once attached to each screw, each part. I was here, and all that was left was waiting for what would happen next. I tried to make sense of it, tried to figure out what to do with what was left of my past, but there was no answer in this emptiness. All my efforts, all my experiments with time, had failed to achieve what I had set out to achieve. I had failed to save the library, to bring back knowledge, to change a single moment in history. Instead, I stood in this laboratory I had created, surrounded by technology that seemed as meaningless as my life. I knew I had to keep going. What else was there to do but keep searching for answers, even if they didn't exist? I walked back to the time device. Its metal rings were still spinning slowly, humming with energy. When I turned on the machine, I felt it pulling me into the unknown. But what next? I didn't know. I didn't know where else I could go to find answers, to regain some of what I had lost. Each new journey, each new leap through time, was just a futile attempt to find meaning where there was none. I remembered how it all began, from the day I decided I could change the course of history. From the moment I realized I could interfere with the events of the past, how I convinced myself that my efforts would not be in vain. But what had changed? I kept returning there, to those moments, to that fire that consumed the library. All my efforts had brought no benefit. I simply found myself in an endless cycle from which there was no escape. I turned the machine on again. I decided to try again, but the confidence I had before was gone. I didn't believe I could do anything meaningful. My resolve was shattered, and now I just kept doing it, because I didn't know how to stop. I felt like I was losing myself in the process again. With each new jump in time, I became more and more detached from reality. All I knew was that I couldn't go back and change what had happened. I couldn't save the library. The machine roared again, and I found myself back in the past. I found myself in the same place, surrounded by the same stone walls. I was back in the library, but what was it? I wasn't sure it was the same place. Everything was the same, but now everything seemed distorted, misshapen. My vision was clouded, and I didn't know how to interpret what was happening around me. I looked at the shelves, at the scrolls, at the paintings, but I saw nothing that could remind me of what I had tried so desperately to preserve. I saw nothing that could give me comfort. It was all just an illusion that I could still change something. I felt my body begin to react again to this strange world I had created. It was alien. It was not the same as before. I looked around again. The library before me was burning, and I was the one who had brought about its destruction. All my efforts were meaningless. All my attempts to save knowledge, to save culture, now seemed empty. I looked at my hands again. They were shaking. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't stop what had happened. I had lost everything, and now I was faced with this grief. I knew I couldn't find meaning in it, but I kept looking. I kept looking for answers that didn't exist. I stood in that place, returning to the same thing over and over again. But there was no salvation, no change, only pain. The pain of not being able to save what I loved, and now not knowing how to return. I turned the machine on again, and I was back in the same place, in the same time. The library had burned down, and I still didn't know what to do. What now? What should I do? I didn't know the answer. And that was the most painful part of it all. Time did not exist here, in this laboratory, where I found myself trapped once again. I seemed to have lost the sense of what was real and what was a figment of my mind. The feeling of emptiness that I had been experiencing for the last month still did not leave me. I stood in front of the time device that I had created myself and could not understand how many more attempts I would need to find at least some answers. All my efforts, all my worries and sacrifices seemed futile. I knew I had to keep going, because it was all I had left. But each new journey, each new jump in time, clouded my thoughts further. I kept coming back to the same place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my contribution hadn't mattered. I could go back to the moment before I created this machine, and everything would be different. But each time I tried to change the past, it went astray again, and I ended up in the same place. This time I found myself in the past again, at a time when the library was still intact, when everything was in order, but I was not happy about it. I witnessed how people around me continued to live their lives, continued to work, read, discuss. I was part of this world, but I could not find my place in it. My eyes were tired and my mind was overloaded. I searched again and again for something that would give me a sense of purpose. I looked at the books, the scrolls I had tried to save, but I couldn't stop thinking that everything I was doing was only making things worse. I walked over to one of the shelves where the ancient manuscripts stood. They were the same as the first time I had been here, but now they seemed so alien to me, so unattainable. I didn't know how to restore what I had lost, how to get back this knowledge that had once been everything to me. It had become something abstract to me, something I could no longer understand. I clutched one of the scrolls in my hands and closed my eyes. What was I supposed to do? How could I ever again become part of this world I had sought to save? I didn't know. The moment I first saw the library brought me neither joy nor relief. It was like a memory of what I had lost. No matter how much I tried, no matter how many times I jumped through time, I could not get back what I had lost. All my efforts seemed empty, and with each new jump I lost touch with reality more and more. Once again, I felt my body begin to fail. My hands tightened around the scroll, but all my efforts were useless. I realized that I could never return to what had been. I could not change the past, and perhaps I should never have tried. I took a step back and the fire consumed the shelves again, burning away the knowledge I had tried to save. I stood in this library, feeling the world crumble around me, and all I could do was watch. The library was disappearing, and I was left in this cycle. What was I looking for? What did I need from time? I never found the answer. Story 2: Returning to my childhood home was hard. I knew it had to be done, but I hadn't prepared myself for what awaited me there. My mother had left the house to me when she died, and now I was forced to return. But this place, it held no warm memories for me, no comfortable refuge where I could come to forget. Instead, every corner of that house was connected to anxiety and fear, to those nights when I was afraid to sleep because it felt like someone was watching me in the dark. I couldn't go to the funeral. It was too much for me. The funeral was probably the last moment I could have left all of this behind, but I just couldn't. When I left my hometown all those years ago, I thought I had left all my demons and memories behind, but returning was much harder than I expected. The house was in the same place as always, and as I drove up, the memories washed over me. The forest around the house seemed so familiar, but at the same time, its thick greenery blurred before my eyes, as if the landscape itself was trying to escape me. I was driving along the same road I used to run on as a child, and as I moved, the confusion grew. I couldn't figure out what exactly was causing this strange fear in me. It was not an ordinary fear, but something deeper, older, elusive. Once outside the house, I smelled the lake. It was so familiar that I closed my eyes for a moment. The lake was part of my childhood, part of something I could not quite forget. As I entered the house, darkness fell. It was oppressive, almost tangible. It was as if the entire house had been swallowed up by this dark and gloomy space that I had once considered my refuge. As I flicked the switch, I realized there would be no light. The electricity was not working, and as I looked around, I realized that nothing in this house was in place as it should have been. I had always thought that I would return here to find comfort, but all I found was emptiness and desolation. I didn't plan to stay here for long. My only goal was to find the money that my mother could leave and then move away. I wasn't sure I could stand being in this house for long, but while everything around was dark and abandoned, I needed to find a way out, and to do that I needed to deal with the problems that arose at every step. The smell of the lake was getting stronger and stronger, and it suddenly seemed to me that it was not only in the air, but also inside me. At some point it became unbearable, and I decided that I needed to put things in order. The next morning I met with the electrician. He was quite calm and confident, although I could tell he didn't want to stay in the house for long. He immediately told me he could fix the electrical, but warned me that the basement had suffered significant water damage. I knew right away that the house needed some serious work, and that it would take a lot more work. I was prepared to leave it as soon as I could sell it, but I didn't know how long that would take. When I went into town, I was greeted by the locals. They were friendly, although I felt their wariness. It was a strange feeling. It was as if I had become a stranger to this place. The town was small, but somehow it seemed as if I had never belonged there. People went about their daily lives, but each one looked at me as if I were part of their forgotten nightmares. I noticed the smell of the lake again, and it was unbearably strong, as if everything around me was saturated with this strange and oppressive smell. As I passed the church, I saw him. Father Vernon was standing at the door, smiling, as if he had been waiting for me. With his appearance, I suddenly felt my legs grow heavy. He hadn't changed. His face was the same as when he was a child, and it gave me a strange uneasiness. I had never liked him, but he had always been a part of this place, a part of what I was trying to forget. He said he was glad to see me, but I felt nothing but emptiness. He kept talking, inviting me to stay for the festival that everyone here seemed to be waiting for. It was a festival I was trying to forget, one I had left when I was 16. It was about a holiday, about a lake, about a church basement, and in my memories, this festival was something more than just a holiday. The moment Father Vernon mentioned the festival, my memories came flooding back. I remembered how every year, for years, we children were locked in the church basement, with Mrs. Shepherd guarding us. There was always something strange, almost sinister about the place, and although the adults never talked about what really happened, I knew there was something terrible about it. My father didn't come home that year, and my mother said he'd just left, but I knew she was lying. I ran away, and I've never been back since. That's when I decided I had to leave. I didn't want to go back to that town. I didn't want to be part of that nightmare. But I knew I had to, and that even if I managed to sell the house and leave, I would never be able to escape what I had experienced here. That place kept pulling me back like a magnet, making me feel like I was still connected to it, that I couldn't escape. The night was silent, and only the sounds of distant coyotes broke the silence. I lay in the darkness, unable to sleep, consumed by this strange feeling that was growing inside me. Something was wrong. Something was wrong with this place, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I felt something coming, something I couldn't escape. In the morning, I woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. The house was quiet, but it was not the usual, familiar silence. It was filled with anxiety, as if the air itself was tense. I looked at the clock. It was late, but I still hadn't fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the night and to my own breathing. The nightmare I had lived through was still vivid in my mind, and at that moment I realized that I couldn't just leave like I had planned. The house kept me here. No matter how hard I tried to escape, I felt how its walls, which seemed so familiar to me, began to squeeze me, imposing their presence. I was ready to finish my work here and leave as quickly as possible. The electricity that the electrician had fixed had not given me back the feeling of home. My plans seemed vague and distant as I looked at the house. No amount of repairs could hide the fact that this house was more than just a building to me. It was filled with something dark, something that was elusive and had not disappeared despite the years that had passed since I had fled. I headed down the stairs. The light in the house was dim and faded, as if it couldn't penetrate the dark corridors of the past. As I reached the bottom floor, something caught my attention. In the corner of the hallway, right next to the stairs, I noticed a strange trail of water. It couldn't be normal, because water shouldn't be able to get in here. Maybe it's from the recent rain, I thought, but quickly realized that didn't explain the strange smell that was beginning to permeate the air. The water trailed across the floor, leaving dark stains behind it, and I suddenly realized that it wasn't there by accident. It was some kind of untamed force, something that shouldn't be in the house. Something I couldn't explain, and it gripped me like a tenacious web. I walked toward the basement. Every step of the stairs echoed in my head, and the lower I went, the more anxious I became. I knew that the basement had always been a part of this house, a part of what scared me. As a child, when I was a kid, I often imagined that there was more to the basement than just dark corners and old furniture. There was something there that I couldn't explain. Every now and then I found myself afraid to go down, but I forced myself, not wanting to give in to this strange feeling of fear. Now, as I stood on the threshold of this very basement, all those childhood fears returned. I looked down into the darkness. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. The basement was not as I remembered it. It was different. The very air seemed polluted, heavy and viscous. This place was no longer just part of the house. It had become something alien, something I did not want to encounter again. I turned around, but there were no people or movement behind me. I was alone, and yet there was a feeling that someone was watching me, that everything around me, this whole house, was not what it should be. A strange feeling permeated me with every step. Everything around me was the same, but at the same time, everything had changed. Even the smell of water was strange, and I did not know where it came from. Trying to pull myself together, I went to the hall closet. I knew that was where my mother kept her money. She always said that it was worth having cash in case of trouble, and now this might be my only chance for salvation. I remembered how often I looked in there as a child. Now it seemed like the last thing that could save me. As soon as I opened the closet door, I felt something strange happening inside. Breathing, very quiet breathing, but it was there, and it was coming from there, from the darkest corner. I recoiled, feeling my insides tighten. This couldn't be real. I remembered how my mother always left things in the closet for emergencies, and this closet was empty, or almost empty. But now, when I opened the door, a wave of fear washed over me. My breathing quickened as I felt something slowly and unobtrusively approaching me. I knew I shouldn't stay here. No way. I took the money my mother had put in that cabinet and quickly headed for the exit, but something stopped me. It's too late. I heard a squelching sound that seemed to be coming from a dark corner of the house. The sound grew louder with each passing second, as if something enormous was moving towards me. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I ran without looking back. My legs seemed to be losing their control, and I stumbled, falling into a dark hallway. The water beneath my feet was becoming increasingly slippery, and I knew that I could not leave so easily. I rushed to the exit, but something stopped me. All my strength left me when I realized that the door was locked. The screams I had heard since early morning were getting louder. Something was moving behind the walls of the house. I had to break free, but I didn't know how. I would never come back here. Light slid through the old windows, refracting and casting strange shadow patterns on the floor. I woke up because the room was too bright. My sleep had been restless, and when I opened my eyes, the feeling was the same. I still felt like I didn't belong here. Returning to this house brought with it not only memories, but also dark feelings that I had tried to ignore all these years. My mother, who had once loved this house so much, had now left it to me, her only heir, but I had a hard time accepting it as my own. I got out of bed, looking at the old wallpaper, at the cracked furniture that had once seemed so cozy. It always seemed to me that this house was breathing, that its walls held something more than just the mundane. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was living in it. Every corner seemed familiar, but at the same time alien. Every memory I tried to push out of my mind seemed to come back to remind me why I left this place. I walked down the stairs, knowing that I would have to face this house again. Every step echoed in my head, and the sound was too loud. Everything was fine, but the air was cold, despite the hot day. I went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Milk, eggs, nothing out of the ordinary. But at that moment, a strange anxiety came over me again. It was impossible to concentrate on what I had to do. All the time I had the feeling that something was watching this house. I realized that I had come here not only for money, but also to sort out what had been bothering me for so many years. I went to the second floor, and although each step was difficult, one thought kept spinning in my head. What should I do with this place? The house was not just a building, it was a cage in which I found myself locked along with my fears and memories. I opened the door of one of the rooms, the same one in which I had once slept, and felt the memories begin to roll over me. I was still a child when this room was my refuge, and now it seemed alien. I walked up to the old mirror. It was cracked, with crimson stains that had not been wiped away even over the years. When I looked into the reflection, it was not myself I saw. The face was alien, as if it belonged to someone long gone. I recoiled, and my heart began to beat faster. This could not be real. My own eyes looked at me as if they were alien, and I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead. Why had I come back here at all? To repeat the mistakes of the past? To experience this horror all over again? A knock at the door distracted me. I ran to the stairs and saw an old woman who had once lived nearby standing at the top of the landing. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand. She was silent, just standing there and watching me go down. Her gaze was so piercing that it made me feel uneasy. I tried to remember her name, but it wouldn't come. It was a strange feeling, as if I knew her, but at the same time I didn't. She told me to be careful. That home wasn't what it seemed. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, looking at her, feeling a chill rise inside me. She was a part of this city, a part of what I'd long tried to forget, and her words wouldn't leave me alone. "You've been away too long," she said, but I couldn't understand what she meant. Her voice sounded like she was talking about something that had nothing to do with me. I walked away from her, feeling her eyes following me even as I turned around. Everything around me was not as it should be again. I was in a hurry, not knowing what to do next. I had to find the money and leave. But this place still held me. A strange feeling of something in the air did not let me go. It was not just a feeling, it was reality. There was some kind of power in the house that did not allow me to leave. I decided I needed to go to the basement. As a child, I was always afraid to go down there. My mother often said that the basement was dangerous, that I shouldn't go there. But now I had to figure it out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong in this house. When I opened the basement door, a cold blast of air hit me in the face. I paused for a moment, feeling fear rising in my stomach. Every step into the dark basement was a step into the unknown. As soon as I descended, I heard a strange sound, like something sliding across the floor. My hands were shaking, but I kept going until I reached the center of the basement. It was dark here, but I felt like something was living in this place. It was like the very ground around me was moving. Something was lurking, not letting me breathe. I looked into the dark corner of the basement, and suddenly I thought I saw something, a silhouette. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely not part of my mind. It was real. I took a step back, but the air was so heavy I couldn't move. It was pulling me into the basement, into dark depths where I couldn't escape. I felt something sliding over my skin, like I was part of something much bigger than just the person in this house. Then I heard a voice, a whisper that sounded familiar. It was Mom, or her voice, but it couldn't be her. Word by word, the whisper grew louder, and in that moment I knew I wasn't alone. I woke up early in the morning, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling of anxiety. It was inside, like a heavy stone in my chest, not giving me peace. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the room was filled with light, and it seemed to me that this light was too bright to be normal. Somehow it didn't fit in with this old, almost forgotten place. I tried to brush my thoughts away, but I still felt how every cell of my body was tense. Today I had to deal with the basement. Yesterday I had already sensed that there was something there, something alien and dark. My curiosity, no matter how hard I tried to hide it, had led me there. And now I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to find out what was hiding in those dark corners under the old house. I got out of bed, went to the mirror, but immediately looked away. I couldn't look at myself because I felt like the reflection didn't belong to me. I left the room, went down the stairs, but this time there was a tension in the air, as if I was breaking something. The house seemed alive, and it seemed to me that it was watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. This house was not just a structure, not just walls, ceilings, and windows. It was something more. Every board, every crack in these walls held a story, but these were not warm memories. I stopped when I reached the basement door. I had thought about it several times before, but I kept putting it off, as if I hoped it would all work itself out. I pulled the handle and opened the door. The same smell, musty, damp, with a hint of rot. It was as dark inside as the very depths of night, but something was drawing me there nonetheless. I didn't know what to expect. Strange memories of my childhood haunted me. My mother always told me not to go into the basement, not to look in its direction, because this place was dangerous. In my childish mind, the basement became something mysterious and scary. And now, after so many years, I stood before this threshold again. I took a step down and froze, hearing a rustling sound. At first I thought it was just a rat or something similar, but soon I realized that the sound was strange, wrong. It was not just the movement of an animal. I picked up the flashlight I had brought with me and shone it on the dark walls of the basement. The light cast a shadow on the floor, and I saw that there were marks on it, marks of water. Water. How could I not have noticed that there was water in the basement? It had been accumulating here for a long time, and apparently this was no ordinary flood. I felt a growing uneasiness. I didn't want to go any further, but I knew I had to go. I walked on, feeling the ground getting wetter and colder with each step. I stopped at an old wooden door that I remembered always being closed. For some reason, it was this door that scared me the most. It was a place I had never entered as a child. I had always been told there was nothing to find there, but now, as an adult, I realized that it was all part of the mystery I couldn't solve. I opened the door, and immediately a smell worse than mustiness hit my nose. It was something vile, unnatural. I took a step inside, and immediately noticed that the air had become thicker, and the light from the flashlight had become dimmer. In that corner of the basement, there was something moving. I froze, trying to focus on what exactly I was seeing. At that moment, it became obvious that I was standing in front of something that I could not call sentient. It was strange, as if there was no time or space in the basement. I saw only blurry shapes and heard rustling sounds. Seconds turned into minutes. I felt like I was having trouble breathing, and suddenly everything around me became blurry. My thoughts became confused, and I began to realize that I couldn't leave this place, that I couldn't leave the basement without finding out what was lurking here. A wave of panic rose up inside me, and I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey me. Fear washed over me, as if I wasn't being let go, as if something was holding me here. I felt something cold and wet touch my leg, and instantly all the sounds in the basement disappeared. At that moment, it became clear to me I was not alone. I closed my eyes and tried to calm down, but it was impossible. Something strong, huge, as if devoid of human form, was moving around me. It felt like time slowed down. I was standing in complete darkness, hearing something coming towards me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of movement tearing through space. I felt something wrap around my arm, and at that moment everything in my head went blank, as if they were trying to pull me into another place. I sighed, feeling the cold creep into my very core, and then I heard a voice. It was a quiet, almost inaudible whisper, but it was loud enough to make me freeze. It wasn't human. I tried to take a step back, but it was as if the basement walls were closing in, not letting me leave. I was here, in the center of this nightmare, and I didn't know what to do. My legs felt heavy, and the fear I felt permeated every cell of my body. I tried to remember what I knew about the basement, everything I had ever been told. My memories were fragments, torn out of context, but they were still real. I tried again and again to find my way back, but I could not. My eyes could not penetrate the dark thickness of the air, which suddenly became viscous, almost tangible. I took a step forward, but then froze, feeling something invisible pulling me back into the dark corners of the basement. It felt like I was being held like a trap, and I couldn't move any further. The humidity in the air was becoming unbearable, and the smell of this place, old, rotten, with a hint of something organic, began to creep into my consciousness, making my skin break out in a cold sweat. I heard that strange whisper again, but this time it was louder, more distinct. It was a voice I couldn't understand, but I knew it didn't come from the world of the living. I tried to open my eyes, but they were glued to the darkness that surrounded me. I felt something cold sliding across my skin, preventing me from breathing normally. At that moment, I remembered that as a child, I had always been afraid of this basement. This place was like a shadow that always followed me. My mother had told me not to go there, not to look in that direction, but now I realized that there was more to those words than just a motherly warning. She knew that there was something more lurking here, something that shouldn't be here. I was short of air and tried to take a deep breath, but all my attempts were in vain. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me. I felt it becoming clearer and clearer, as if it were materializing out of thin air. Its outlines were vague, but it clearly existed. My heart was pounding wildly, and I instinctively stepped back, but the figure continued to approach, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed familiar, as if I had seen it before, in some other world, in another time. I felt the weight of this place falling on me. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do, how to fight this fear that wouldn't let me move. The figure took another step closer, and I realized that it was not just a creature. It was something alive, but at the same time unnatural. I knew that it did not belong to this world. Its eyes were dark as the void itself, and they did not take their gaze off me. I felt its presence pierce through me, as if it could read my every thought. Suddenly, the figure extended a hand towards me, and I froze. I couldn't understand what it wanted. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if I was being held captive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being held here not just by force, but by some higher intelligence. I could hear my thoughts echoing in my head, as if someone else in another place could listen to me. The whispers grew louder again, and I realized that they were not just whispers. They were words that could not be spoken by a living being. They were ringing in my head, filling every corner of my consciousness. They were not words in a language I knew, but I somehow intuitively understood their meaning. Then the figure took a step forward, and everything around me seemed to blur, as if space had become unstable. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer in the basement. I was somewhere else, not in this world. I was in emptiness, surrounded by cold and darkness. And then I realized that I had never really left this house. I was in another dimension, another time, and now I was standing in front of something I couldn't understand. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. I tried to resist, but my body was frozen. I didn't know what was happening to me, and I wasn't given time to think. Only at that moment, when the figure approached me, did I realize that this was not a nightmare. This was reality, a reality that I would now have to face. I stood there frozen, as if in an icy captivity, and the darkness around me grew thicker, like something alive, penetrating every corner of my consciousness. Everything was blurry and distorted, and in that moment I realized that I was no longer human. I was part of this place, this emptiness, this world that had no beginning and no end. Something invisible was pulling me deeper into this world, and I could not understand how I had ended up here. My mind was paralyzed, as if I was trapped. There was no sound, no movement around me, only a hollow silence that crushed me from within. I tried to think, tried to understand what was happening, but nothing came. All I knew was that I was not alone. Someone was there, watching me. I felt it in every corner of my soul, like something that had always been there, close by, but had never made itself known. But now I knew it was here, and it saw me. As the figure took another step forward, I felt the air around me become thick and viscous, as if the entire atmosphere had been compressed, forming an unbearable pressure on my body and mind. I opened my eyes, and before me, in the dim light, appeared the very image, the creature that had brought me here. Its eyes glowed like two black mirrors, reflecting all my fears and doubts, and although it did not move, I felt how its gaze pierced me, as if penetrating into the very depths of my soul. I tried to move away, but my legs wouldn't obey me. My fear was so strong that I couldn't even move. All I could do was stand there, frozen in that horrible space. Suddenly the creature took another step, and I realized that it wasn't just physically approaching me. It was part of this world, part of the horror I felt but couldn't understand. Then I felt thoughts that weren't mine start to form in my head, as if someone was trying to force them into my consciousness, to force me to think the way they wanted. I tried to resist, but it was like fighting a river current. Every thought, every image that I tried to push out of my head came back, more and more intrusively. I closed my eyes, hoping it would stop, but I realized it wouldn't. I opened my eyes and saw the darkness around me growing thicker, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. And then, at the very last moment, I felt this darkness grab me by the arms, pull me in, as if I became a part of it, dissolved into its vastness. I found myself back in that strange, empty place, with no end and no beginning, just darkness and its vast power. I tried to understand what was happening, but instead I just stood there, consumed by its power. There was nothing I could do but give in. I couldn't resist, I couldn't fight. This wasn't just space, it was something bigger, something I couldn't comprehend. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was quiet, almost inaudible, but I could feel it, as if it were coming from somewhere inside me. It was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. Yet there was something familiar about that whisper. I felt it enveloping me, wrapping itself around my consciousness. I knew that this creature had not simply brought me here. It was a part of me, a part of what I had once left behind, a part of something that could not be forgotten. And then, when I was about to give up, when it seemed to me that the darkness had swallowed me up, I heard a new sound. It was the sound of footsteps. Footsteps that walked across this empty, viscous space. Footsteps that were getting closer to me with every passing moment. I tried to look, but my eyes could not penetrate this darkness. I felt the footsteps getting closer, but I could not understand who it was. Everything was too confusing, and every sound echoed in my head. And then a figure appeared before me. It was a man, or rather, something that looked like a man. It was not entirely material, more of a silhouette, almost ghostly, but I felt its presence. It stood before me, and I could feel its gaze, cold as ice. But there was something else in that gaze, something familiar. Then I understood. It was me. I stood before myself, before who I once was. And suddenly everything became clear. Everything I had experienced, all these memories, fears, worries, pains, all of it was a part of me. I myself was what brought me here, to this place. Everything that was happening was just a reflection of my inner state, my own horror and guilt. I stood before myself, in this dark, empty world, and realized that I was about to meet not something external, but myself. I sat in this darkness, surrounded by a fear that would not let go of me, and with each passing moment it became more acute. This feeling of not being alone, but at the same time completely isolated, filled me with anxiety. The feeling of my own helplessness grew like a snowball, and I did not know how to cope with it. It seemed to me that the space around me was freezing, time was losing its meaning, and each moment stretched out like an eternity. The darkness here was not just physical. It was a dense, almost tangible shadow that pressed me from all sides, preventing me from taking a single step. I tried to remember how I had gotten here, but all the memories washed away like water from a stone. My thoughts were confused, and it seemed to me that I was forgetting not only my past life, but the very essence of who I am. I listened for sounds, but I heard nothing but my own breathing. A terrible silence surrounded me, as if everything I knew, everything I had ever experienced, had vanished, dissolved into thin air. The only thing that remained was this tense anticipation of something that was about to happen, but that I could not understand. And then, when I was about to give up, when all hope of returning to reality was fading, I felt a change. It was something I couldn't name, but it was like a cold gust of wind that ran across my skin, leaving an unnatural chill. I felt something in the air change, the space around me tremble, and I knew it wasn't just a change, it was a signal. At first I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. This signal, this change seemed to come out of nowhere. I tried to focus, to listen to myself, to try to find some clue that would help me understand what was happening, but all my efforts ended in failure. All this darkness, all this uncertainty consumed me. And then, like a flash of lightning in the dark night sky, I remembered. I remembered everything. I remembered what had happened so many years ago, the day I ran away, the moment I refused to believe what was happening in Pine Grove, I remembered the festival, the old church, the children I would never see again. I remembered Father Vernon's face, the way his smile seemed so sincere and so fake at the same time. I remembered leaving, trying to forget this town and everything about it. But now, here in this darkness, I realized that I couldn't forget. I couldn't just erase what had happened. It was more than just fear. It was something that was woven into the very fabric of my existence. And no matter how hard I tried to escape, I was still connected to this place. I tried to figure out what to do now, how to get out, how to get rid of this darkness that filled me, penetrated my thoughts and feelings. But all the answers went into the void, into a space where there was nothing but my own fears and guilt. I was like a prisoner, locked in my own soul. And then, just when I thought I had completely lost touch with reality, I felt footsteps. At first they were barely noticeable, almost invisible, but with each step they became more distinct, more real. I felt something approaching me, and despite all the terror I was feeling, I felt relief, like someone or something was nearby, and it was somehow familiar. But what really struck me was that with every step, with every movement, the sound began to impose itself on me, like something familiar but forgotten. I couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling of mounting fear only grew stronger. It was something terrible, something I couldn't see or feel but knew intuitively. And when the figure finally appeared before me, I knew it was me. I was standing before myself, face to face with what I had become. It wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just a mirror. It was me, but different. I saw his eyes, and they were like mine, but there was something different about them. Something dark that I couldn't understand. He looked at me, and there was something ancient and menacing in his gaze. It was like a confrontation with the very essence of what I was trying to escape. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. I felt like the whole world was crumbling around me, like everything I knew was falling apart. And in that moment, I knew I can't go back. I can't escape what's about to happen. I was a part of this, a part of everything, and maybe I'd always been a part of this. Story 3, my first memory was of an apple. It sounds so simple, but it contained my whole life, my whole being. I remember the way the hard flesh creaked between my teeth, the way the rind cracked, and the juice, sweet and thick, ran down my chin, leaving marks I never had time to erase. It was an ordinary apple, but it was something important to me. I felt its freshness filling me with strength, how it seemed to give me a part of its existence. I loved the taste, its juiciness, its life. I remember thinking about how everything I touched left a mark on me. My fingers were sticky with sap, and I didn't know how to get rid of that stickiness until I walked to the stream. I remember the cold water washing over my hands, the coolness soaking into me, taking away the excess. That feeling of cleanliness and freshness as I washed away traces of the world that surrounded me. I knew that this would be one of those moments that would be etched in my memory forever. That stream was a place I often visited. It was not large, but its waters were always fresh, cool. The water flowed so smoothly, as if it was not in a hurry, unhurriedly, as if it understood that I needed time to comprehend what I was seeing. I would sit by its bank, bow my head, and watch the drops of water reflecting the light, shimmer in the rays of the sun. I loved spending time in that peace and quiet, but most of all I loved watching how nature interacted with itself, how it worked, how it grew. When spring began to paint the earth in soft shades of green and pink, I always knew that something new was about to begin. The tree that gave me apples was beginning to bloom again. Their petals were pink, almost white at the tips, and when they opened, it was like the beginning of something greater. I watched the tree as it woke up, and I always rejoiced in its life, as if I were part of this amazing process. I always felt closer to the tree when it bloomed, and it brought me a sense of fullness of being. My joy was heightened when little shoots began to appear on the ground near the tree. I remembered standing there, watching in wonder as the first green leaves opened, reaching for the light. I felt this life unfolding before me, and I knew that there was something big hidden in these little shoots. I saw the tree giving birth to a new generation. It was a cycle that repeated itself over and over again. Each year the tree grew, but I knew that new seedlings would also grow alongside it, producing new fruit, just as its parent had done. I felt proud of each new tree that grew next to the old one, and I often stood and watched them grow. It was like magic, a miracle that I couldn't explain, but which I felt with my whole being. I knew that I was something special to this tree. Maybe I was its protector, maybe its friend. I never questioned it because it was natural. But one day everything changed. The lightning struck the tree, and that was the moment I knew something was gone forever. I remember the sky darkening, the wind picking up, and the sky splitting in two as the lightning struck the top of the tree. I saw it shake, its branches burning, and it felt like the end of the world. The lightning passed through the tree, and I saw its leaves wither, its bark darken and crack. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. I felt a part of me slipping away with each destruction of this great being. It was the end for the tree and for me. The tree lived for some time, but its life was already at an end. It could no longer bear fruit, and its leaves had become wrinkled and black. I stood beneath it and felt it moving away from me, its life gradually fading away, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. I could not understand why this had happened. I could not understand how such a large tree, which had given me so much fruit and joy, could disappear so quickly. I decided to take care of the new trees that were born next to it. I tended them, watered them, protected them from all sorts of troubles. I felt it was my duty to continue what had been started. I didn't know why, but I understood that they were like a continuation of what was gone, and I had to give them a chance to live. Maybe it was the only thing I could do to pay tribute to the tribute I loved so much. Sometimes I wondered where I came from. I didn't know who came before me, who cared for the first tree when it was small and helpless. Were there others like me? It was a strange feeling, searching for your place in the world when you don't even know who you are. There were many different creatures in the forest, but I didn't see anyone like me. There were other trees, other animals, but no one like me. I looked at my reflection in a pond and tried to understand what I saw. All I saw was one boy standing by the water, and in that reflection, maybe I was trying to find my way. I often went to the pond to look at myself. I looked at my eyes, at my hands, and tried to understand how I perceived myself. A boy with eyes that were always searching for something they couldn't find. I was alone, and that knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. I didn't know who I was, but I was part of something great happening around me, and maybe that was enough. Every morning began the same way. I would wake up and the first rays of the sun would break through the leaves of the trees, softly illuminating the space around me. It was like one big, long awakening. I could feel the light filling me with energy, every cell of my body waking up along with the forest. In this morning light, the world seemed simple and clear. I knew that there would be another day ahead, filled with work and worries. But in this light, everything seemed right, without unnecessary questions. The forest was my home, and it wasn't just a place where I lived. It was a place where I could be myself, where I could watch all living things grow and change. I always felt a part of this world. Every tree, every stone, every path in the forest was familiar to me. I knew where the tastiest berries were hidden, where the moisture was especially deep, and where the grass I needed grew. But most of all, I knew about my tree. It was my friend, my mentor, my support. When I was little, I loved to spend my days under this tree. I would sit at its base and just listen to the leaves rustling in the wind, the birds singing their melodies. It was a special feeling to be with this tree that had given me my first apple so many years ago. I knew that its branches protected me, that its roots went deep into the earth, supporting it like everything else around it. This tree was not just part of the forest, it was its heart. But over time, I began to notice how the forest was changing. Each year, it became a little different. Some trees were dying, others were growing faster than I expected. The leaves were turning yellow earlier than usual, and the wind was carrying sharper smells. I felt something in the air, like the world around me was becoming more fragile. I saw the trees go, their shape and structure change. When one fell, I always felt a sense of loss. It was like losing an old friend. But I had to move on because the forest lived on, it grew. I left this place, but I always came back. Because despite the changes, despite the disappearance, I knew this place was still mine. It was home, and I was ready to embrace whatever it had to offer. One day, after a big storm, I noticed something strange. When I returned to my tree, it didn't look like usual. The branches were damaged, and I saw one of them break off and fall to the ground. I came closer and saw that the bark was cracked, and somewhere deep in the tree there was a mark. This was the first thing I noticed, but what struck me was not the fact of destruction itself, but how the tree continued to live despite it. Even the broken branch that lay next to its roots was trying to grow. Little shoots were coming out of it. I didn't know what it was, but I felt that the tree was continuing to fight for its life despite everything. I began to spend more and more time with the tree. It could no longer produce the same apples as before, but I still cared for it. I watered it, cleared away the branches and leaves that were clogging its roots. I could feel its struggle, and I was ready to support it. It was like watching a friend who was slowly losing strength, but not giving up. I knew that the tree was a part of me, and I could not leave it in trouble. I did not know how long it would take before it finally died, but I hoped that it would survive at least one more summer. Several years passed. Each year the tree became weaker, but it continued to live. Every spring it still tried to bloom its pink flowers, but not as often as before. I stood under it and felt how it weakened. Sometimes it seemed to me that the tree almost did not remember what it was like when I first found it. It had become different, more fragile, but it still continued to fight for its life. And I knew that despite its withering, it remained a part of me, a part of my world. Even if it could no longer give me fruit, it still gave me something important. I continued to care for it, continued to watch its life. But one day, when I came to it, I noticed that its branches were no longer moving in the wind. It stood as if frozen in its dying state. I realized that it could no longer fight. I looked at it and felt pain. It was like losing a part of myself, but I knew that I had to move on. I knew that everything that lives must go someday, and that perhaps the time had come for this tree. But even as I said goodbye to it, I felt no bitterness. I knew that it had lived its life, and that it was as much a part of me as I was a part of it. I promised myself that I would continue to care for its descendants, the trees that had grown up alongside it. I knew it was right that I should continue to care for the forests as they had once cared for me. I was ready to embrace change and see the world with new understanding. The forest lived on, and perhaps I would too. I didn't know that from the very beginning my life was part of something much more complex. As a child, it seemed to me that I simply existed, and around me was a world full of miracles and amazing things. But over time, I began to understand that behind each element of this world there is its own story, its own destiny. And every event, Every meeting and every choice I made had its price. I always thought of myself as an outside observer, a person who can be a part of life but not influence it too much. My existence was like water that flows in a river. It is always there, but never stays in one place. I got used to it. I accepted my role. But one day I realized that I had long ago become not just an observer, but a part of something much bigger. I began to notice that every day I meet people who leave a mark on my life and I on theirs. This process, this continuous connection between us, seemed as natural to me as breathing. I didn't think about it until one day I encountered a man who showed me how wrong I was. We met by chance. It was an ordinary day like all the others, when I was walking down the street and thinking about what would happen next. We did not discuss the weather or the news. He was silent and reserved, with a look that seemed both hazy and clear. I felt his presence fill me with questions to which I did not know the answers. I did not know what he wanted to tell me, and perhaps he himself did not know, but his look made me feel that something important was happening. I don't know how long we stood there, just looking at each other, but it was a powerful moment, one I would never forget. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than words. Something about his silence, his stillness, made me wonder about what I had been missing for so long. It was like a revelation, like a light that suddenly cuts through the darkness and you begin to see what was hidden. I didn't know what to make of it, so I left the same way I came, silently, but his gaze stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't appeared in my life by chance. Maybe he was just a random passerby, but I felt that this moment mattered. It was like a key that opened a door to a new world, full of questions and reflections. I started looking for answers I didn't know. I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before, and it seemed the more I learned, the less I understood. It was a strange paradoxical situation where everything became clearer but also more confusing at the same time. I felt like an abyss was opening up before me, and how hard it was to understand what was really going on. Every day I continued to reflect on what I had seen and felt, but every time I tried to find an explanation, it eluded me. It seemed to me that this man was connected to something more than just a chance encounter. He was part of something more complex, as we all are. It was the beginning of my search, my questions and my journey, which might not lead me to answers, but which would certainly make me look at the world in a new way. From the day I met him, everything started to change. I started to notice more details. Every look, every word, every gesture seemed more significant than before, and I realized that life is not just a chain of random events. It is a labyrinth in which we are all connected, and every step can lead to something greater than we expect. I began to feel how all the elements of my life were connected. Every move, every decision seemed to be part of a huge mechanism that I could not fully understand, but I felt like I was in it. It was strange and disturbing, but also exciting. But despite all the questions, despite all the thinking, I didn't know how exactly this world was supposed to be for me. I didn't know where this path was leading, but I knew I couldn't stop. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew I couldn't be who I was anymore. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. I was part of this story, part of something bigger than I could ever imagine. And I didn't know what was coming next. One night I woke up as if someone invisible had woken me up, and I immediately realized that something had changed. The silence that usually surrounded my house became thick and heavy, as if the air itself was thickening. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, but I couldn't figure out what was bothering me. For a moment it seemed to me that time had slowed down, and the space around me had become somehow unnatural, almost unnatural. I wanted to get up, stand up, take at least one step, but my body was as if paralyzed. I continued to lie there, listening to the sounds of the night. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own breathing, and although I did not feel anything dangerous, a strange, almost painful feeling of uneasiness arose in my chest. I was not afraid, but I felt some kind of anxiety slowly filling the space around me. After a while, I got out of bed. I couldn't find a place to sit, feeling the tension build up with every step. I went out into the hallway and stopped at the window, looking out at the dark, drooping trees. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and only the echoes of the evening light still dimly illuminated the ground. The night seemed to stand still, not moving, not changing. It was as if everything around had frozen. I stood there and thought about what could be causing this feeling. I didn't know what could be the source of this strange uneasiness. I've lived in this house for many years, and it has always been quiet. I was used to its walls being filled with echoes of past years, and I never noticed any changes. But now, at this moment, it seemed to me that something was wrong. No matter how hard I tried to calm myself down, my anxiety wouldn't go away. It was more than just fear. It was like a feeling of someone or something watching me from the darkness, hidden and unknowable. I felt like the space around me wasn't just empty, but filled with something I couldn't understand, but that was clearly there. Suddenly I heard a sound. At first I thought it might be the wind, but then I realized it was a step. Light, almost imperceptible, as if someone was carefully moving around the house. I froze, listening. The silence was back, but there was something different about it now. I felt that there was something behind that step, something unknown and frightening. I decided to check what was going on. My steps were quiet. I moved through the house, listening to every sound. But the further I went, the more I felt a strange presence in the air. It was something I couldn't see, but it was close, almost tangible. I approached the door, which was always closed, but now it seemed especially cold, as if there was something dark and unfamiliar behind it. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air was thick, filled with something mysterious. I couldn't figure out what it was. My body tensed, and I felt my muscles freeze, as if I was standing in the very center of something incredibly important. And then, at that moment, I heard it again. It wasn't just footsteps. It was something more, a rustling, as if something was moving across the room, as if an invisible force was running across the floor. I looked around, but I saw nothing. But I felt that something was there, close, almost touching me. I slowly walked towards the center of the room, trying to figure out what was going on. And suddenly a strange figure appeared in front of me. It was like a shadow, but not quite a shadow, as if the air itself had become darker. It was not clearly defined, and its outlines changed with each passing moment. I felt something about it pulling me in, but also pushing me away. My mind was trying to figure out what it was. I saw this silhouette, but I couldn't make it out. It was like the feeling when you look at something in the dark, but you can't see what it is. I felt like it wasn't just a vision. It was like something real, alive, but illogical. My hands were shaking, and I wanted to move away, but I couldn't. I stood there, motionless, and looked at the silhouette that seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time. It wasn't part of this world. It wasn't part of my home, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. But something about it held me, as if I couldn't look away, as if I needed to figure out what it was. I took a step forward, but immediately felt the air around me become denser. It seemed like everything in the room was freezing. I couldn't breathe, and all the sounds I was used to hearing were gone. The silence was so great that I began to doubt whether I was really there, or if it was just my mind clouded by something incomprehensible. Then the silhouette was gone. It simply dissolved, as if it had never been there. But its presence remained in the air, something I couldn't put into words. I stood alone in the room, and even though nothing had changed outwardly, I knew I would never forget this moment. As I left the room and closed the door, I felt the whole atmosphere around me gradually return to normal, but there was a heaviness in my heart. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt that what I had just experienced was not an accident. It wasn't just a night terror. It was something more, something beyond my understanding. From then on, I couldn't just relax. Every night when I closed my eyes, I felt like something invisible was watching me, like what I saw that night was following me, and I knew that at any moment it could come back. I woke up that night when the sky was special, and the moonlight filled the room with its cold light, which seemed somehow alien and uncertain. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, and felt a strange uneasiness spreading throughout my body, as if something was wrong, although I could not understand what. Everything around me was familiar and calm, but inside me something was moving, like a small creature living in a dark corner of my mind. Usually the nights in this house were silent. I was used to it, to the sound of the wind blowing through the window, to the quiet creaks of the old wooden beams that seemed alive and forever preserving their memory. This was my home. I knew it like the back of my hand. But this night it was different. The air was thick and hard to breathe, as if each breath required effort. I tried to roll over, closing my eyes, hoping that it was just my imagination, that my fears were just a figment of my nightly thoughts, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I felt the air around me change. It was becoming thick, like a viscous liquid. It was as if the house itself was beginning to breathe, and its breathing was becoming heavier and heavier. Unable to stay in bed any longer, I stood up. My legs, which should have been so steady and sure, seemed to be refusing to obey me. Each step was cautious, as if I were walking along some invisible line where it would be easy to lose my balance. I walked into the hallway. Its walls seemed alien, and I felt as if my every step was being recorded, as if the house was watching me closely. I went to the window and opened it, hoping that the fresh air would dispel this incomprehensible fear. But even the fresh air I breathed in felt heavy. I looked outside, and at that very moment an icy chill ran through my body. Everything around was shrouded in fog, which filled the forest outside the window. The sky was gloomy, and I could not discern where the earth ended and the sky began. Only here and there, through the fog, could I see the dark silhouettes of trees which seemed unnaturally tall and curved, as if they were not part of this world. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Suddenly I found it hard to breathe. The room was dark again, and even the moon, which had seemed so bright just a few minutes ago, had disappeared behind the clouds. I closed the window and went back into the hallway, but the strange feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. I felt my body covered in cold sweat. With each step I was getting closer to the stairs that led to the basement. My gaze involuntarily stopped there, as if something below was calling me. I didn't know why, but I went down. The fear that should have stopped me only pushed me on. Each step was taken with difficulty, as if someone invisible was standing behind me and forcing me to move forward. The steps were creaky and slippery from the old wood, and each step echoed in the empty walls. When I reached the basement, I stopped at the door. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew this was not the place I should be entering. But something inside me was pushing me further. I pushed the door open, and immediately felt the cold coming down on me. It wasn't just cold, like any other part of the house. It was eerie, as if the cold was a living thing that lived and breathed in the dark corners of the basement. The basement was dark. I couldn't see anything except the dim light from a single bulb hanging high above my head. In that light, I could make out old furniture, crates and boxes that seemed as unchanged as the house itself. But something was wrong. I felt like every movement I made disturbed the thin fabric of silence, as if I had awakened something that should have remained quiet. I took a few steps forward, and that was when I noticed the door behind me close. It didn't just close, it slammed shut with force, as if an invisible hand had pushed it. I turned around and saw the light from the bulb dim for a moment, then begin to flicker dimly again. My heart started beating faster, and I felt the air become even thicker. I stood rooted to the spot. The basement walls began to change, their outlines becoming blurry, and I saw strange shadows moving in the dark corners. They weren't just shadows. They were creatures that shouldn't exist here. Their shapes shifted, merging and dissipating as if they were made of air itself. I felt something pulling me in. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, and as soon as I did, I felt the ground beneath me begin to give way, as if I were walking on unstable sand. I tried to break free, but the more I moved, the more I felt something invisible holding me back. And suddenly I realized that I was not alone. I was not alone in this basement. I heard whispers, barely audible, but distinct, as if something or someone was calling me. These voices were not loud, but they were close. I froze. Everything around froze. I couldn't move anymore. My body was paralyzed with fear. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, something unknown began to approach me. He walked through the forest, looking at the trees. Each of them was not just a plant for him, but something much more important. They were his friends, his companions in this world full of wonders and secrets. He watched their branches sway in the wind, their leaves rustle softly. He knew their faces, their rough bark, their grandeur. And although he was alone, in this forest he never felt lonely. The boy stopped by one of the trees. It was a large tree, one of the oldest in the forest. It stood in the middle of a clearing, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching up to the sky. He crouched by its trunk and placed his hand on the bark. It was cold to the touch, but there was a power in it that was transmitted to him. He closed his eyes, as if hoping to feel the tree speak to him. He knew that everything in this forest was connected, and even if he could not hear them in words, he could feel them. The boy sat there, feeling the ground beneath him vibrate, as if it were responding to his presence. He loved the feeling. It wasn't just a sense of safety, it was something much deeper. He knew that if he were more like all the other creatures in the forest, he could understand them better, could talk to them. But for now, his world was limited to this, to what he could see and feel. Sometimes he wanted to be part of something bigger than just a boy walking in the forest. He looked at his fellows, at the trees, at the plants, at the animals, and he thought that they were all much older than him, wiser, that there was something more to their lives. He stood up and walked through the forest again. The wind had become stronger, but he felt neither cold nor fear. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his thoughts still returned to the trees, to this world in which he was only a small link. He understood that one day everything would change. The trees would grow, new trees would bear fruit, and life in the forest would go on. And like all living things, he too was part of this cycle. He couldn't explain why he was drawn to this forest, to these trees, why he felt that this was his place. But despite all this, he knew one thing: he would never leave here. His life was inextricably linked with this forest, and although he could not find an explanation for his thoughts, his heart always led him here, wherever he went. When night fell and the stars began to shine in the sky, the boy stopped by one of the oldest trees. He lay down on the grass, listening to the trees rustling in the wind, their branches bending and cracking. Sometimes it seemed to him that the forest itself was whispering, conveying to him some unspoken words, full of meaning that he could not understand. But it didn't matter. He knew that someday, in the future, he would be like this tree, old, majestic, full of wisdom. But for now, his life was just beginning. He closed his eyes and lost himself in his thoughts, knowing that something important was waiting for him ahead. Suddenly, he felt his body relax, and before he knew it, he was asleep. The same dream, the same image, the same world. The boy found himself in a clearing again, surrounded by ancient trees. This time they seemed even more majestic, and their bark was rougher. He slowly approached one of them, put his hand on the trunk, and felt the energy being transmitted from the tree to his body. It was a familiar feeling, like coming home. He looked up at the branches of the tree and realized that this connection was more important than just being close to nature. He felt that the forest and its trees were part of his being, and in that moment, he realized that his task was to become like that tree, to be as generous and wise as that tree. A vision appeared in his mind. He had become a tree, with branches reaching high into the sky, roots that went into the earth itself. He had become part of this world, part of a life that would continue even after he was gone. When he woke up in the morning, he felt strangely at peace. He no longer felt the worries that had plagued him before. He knew that everything he needed was right in front of him. He was a part of this forest, and the forest was a part of him. He stood up, walked to the nearest tree, and quietly touched its bark. At that moment, he realized that his life would be tied to this forest forever. He was not just a boy, he was part of a great and inexplicable cycle that could not be stopped. From that day on, he no longer felt alone. He was not just an observer, he was a part of this world, and everything that happened around him made sense. With each passing day, he felt like he was becoming a part of this forest, and he knew that someday, like the trees, he too would continue to live, even if his body disappeared. He took another step forward, and continued his way among the trees, knowing that his place was here, among these majestic creatures that gave him strength and meaning. Another spring had come. The forest was filled with sounds again, the same soft wind that caressed his face, the rustling of leaves, the birds singing their songs in the branches of the trees. For the boy, this sound was like a melody he had known since childhood. He walked among the trees again, feeling their strength and grandeur. He always returned here, and each time it seemed that something important was happening here, that his place was among these mighty creatures. As he approached one of the trees, something unusual caught his attention. The branches, which had once been thick and green, now seemed slightly dried out, as if the life in them had dried up. The boy stood looking at the tree, trying to understand what had happened. He reached out and touched its bark. It was strangely cold, and his palm did not feel the warmth that always emanated from the trees. He felt a sense of unease begin to grow inside him. How could this tree, so strong and ancient, lose its power? His gaze moved to the other trees, and he noticed that they, too, were beginning to look different. The leaves no longer glistened in the sunlight, and the bark no longer had its usual roughness. The boy felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was something more than just a change, something he found hard to understand. He continued walking, trying to ignore it, but the thought of what might be wrong wouldn't go away. The forest had always been his home, his safe place, and now something in the world had changed. He felt the forest begin to recede, as if this place was no longer the same as he knew it. Lost in his thoughts, he walked to the pond. It was the same pond where he had often sat before, watching his reflection. The water was dark and calm, but today it seemed murky and cold. The boy sat down by the water and looked at his reflection. His face, which had once looked so young and full of life, now seemed slightly dull, as if something was threatening his own existence. He raised his hand and touched the surface of the water. The waves his touch caused disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but they did not bring with them the feeling of life he had once felt. The water was cold. It did not return to him the warmth it had given him before. The boy felt that the moment had come when he needed to understand what was happening to this world. The forest was his home, his refuge, and now something had changed. He stood up and resolutely headed deeper into the forest. He had to find the answer. As he passed the trees, he began to notice that the forest no longer whispered, no longer told him its ancient secrets. He could no longer hear the branches rustling or feel the breath of the earth beneath his fingernails. This place, which had always been full of life, now seemed empty, lifeless. The boy felt his steps echoing in the void. He could no longer ignore this feeling. Deep in the forest, he stopped in front of the very tree he felt was the symbol of this change. It stood in the middle of a clearing, but now its roots seemed cracked, and its branches did not reach toward the sky as they once did. The boy walked closer and placed his hand on the trunk. He felt the earth beneath him vibrate, as if it were trying to tell him something. He knew the tree was not dead, but it was weakened, exhausted. Something inside the boy twitched. He realized that if this tree disappeared, if it lost its power, then the entire forest would suffer, and perhaps he would too. He felt his connection to this world begin to weaken. It was as if this was the last day of his existence, when he could no longer stop the flow of time. In despair, he sat down next to the tree, his head down. He felt his heart filling with sadness. He didn't know what to do. He no longer knew how to save this world, how to give it back its power. Suddenly, he felt something soft touch his shoulder. He looked back and saw a tree branch leaning towards him, as if hugging him. It was a gesture full of love and care. He felt the warmth returning to him, but his heartache did not go away. The boy realized that this forest was alive, and that he had the power to do everything he could to preserve it. He stood up, determined not to give up, knowing that his job was to be the one who would protect this land, who would preserve the memory of what had been. He promised himself that he would fight as a tree fights for its life, even if everything around him was falling apart. He looked again at the trees standing there, silent and majestic, and felt their strength returning to him. In that moment, he realized that everything he needed was right in front of him. He was part of this forest, part of this land, and only with it could he survive any change. And despite everything that was happening, he knew that his connection to this world was unbreakable. He couldn't leave it, and he wasn't going to. So he remained in the forest among the trees to guard it, as was his destiny. And perhaps someday, if he remained true to his path, his care would bring back strength and life.